All right, starting lesson 4.5b, graphs of sine and cosine functions. In the previous lesson, we focused on the graph of sine. In this lesson, we'll focus on the graph of cosine. Now, you'll notice that the graphs are quite similar, with a couple exceptions. All right, for the parent function of cosine, it doesn't start off at 0. All right, it starts off at 1. All right, whatever the amplitude is. All right, amplitude's 1. All right, from there it goes down. All right, then it goes down again, where your minimum is. It goes up, and it goes up again to your maximum. So there are two maximums, one minimum, and there are two intercepts. Here are intercepts. Okay, x-intercepts. All right, but everything else is the same. All right, we divide the cycle into 4 parts. A normal cycle, or period, has a length of 2 pi. All right, 2 pi. And so if we take 2 pi, we divide it by 4 to get our 4 parts. We move by increments of pi over 2. So pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2. And that's how we get one cycle for our graph. All right, everything else is the same. All right, so let's go on and work with some examples. All right, here I have 3 for my amplitude. All right, absolute value of 3, absolute value of 3 is 3. Okay, and that's the most important piece of information. And then we also have to divide the graph into 4 parts. So what's the normal period? Well, nothing's going on with the period here. The b value is 1. So I have 2 pi, I divide that by 4, and I get pi over 2. So I'm moving by increments of pi over 2. So that's pi over 2. That's 2 pi over 2, that's 3 pi over 2, and that's 4 pi over 2. Okay, I'm working with cosine. Where do I start? I start at the maximum, or I apply the amplitude in this case. So I'm going to start off at 3, and then I move down to the intercept, and then I move down to my minimum, then I move up back to my intercept, and up again to my maximum. And there is one cycle of the graph. All right, it's easy as that. So here I could continue it. If I want to continue to cover the whole grid. All right, let's do another example. All right, here I have an amplitude of 1. All right, the value here is 1. All right, and then my b value here is 2. All right, so what do you do in this case? Well, I take the period, or to get my period, I take the normal period, which is what? 2 pi, and I divide it by b, which in this case is 2. So my period is pi. Now, I'm going to divide the graph into 4 parts. So I take the period, which is pi, and I divide it by 4. All right, so since I already have pi here, this is pi over 2. This is pi over 4 then. Half of pi over 2 is pi over 4. So pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, and then 4 pi over 4, which is pi. All right, and that's all I need. So working with cosine, we start off at the maximum, which is 1. Then we go to the intercept, 0, and I go to -1. And I go to 0, and back to the maximum. So there we go. All right, if you want more of the graph, you just continue the pattern now. All right, pretty simple stuff. All right, there's your wave or your oscillation. Another example. All right, what impact is that going to have on the graph? That's your phase shift. All right, so first thing, amplitude is 1. Nothing's happening to the period because the b value is 1. All right, so I do a phase shift. So that's going to move my starting value. So I take x plus pi over 2, and I set that equal to 0. Solve it, and I get x is equal to -pi over 2. That's my start. All right, for my finish, all right, I get -pi over 2 plus, what's the period? The period is 2 pi. So I end up with, simplifying this, I get 3/2 pi. That's another important piece of information. And then what else? I need to divide it to 4 parts. So I take the period and I divide by 4, which is pi over 2. Alrighty, so I start at negative pi over 2, that's going to be right here. And I move by increments of pi over 2, so here I have pi over 2, negative pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 0, then I have pi over 2, then I have 2 pi over 2, then I have 3 pi over 2. Alright, and I'm starting at 1 for the amplitude, so I start here at the maximum. Alright, there we go, and then I go 0, negative 1, 0, positive 1. Alright, so there's my graph. If I want to continue, just repeat the pattern. Pretty simple stuff. Alright, so we've gone through the amplitude, manipulating the period, also manipulating the starting point, and the last component is the vertical translation. Alright, so we're just moving down too. Alright, so pretty simple stuff. The amplitude's 1. I have to divide the graph into 4 parts. The normal period is 2 pi. So I have pi over 2. So here on the grid, I'm going to have pi over 2. Then I have 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, and 4 pi over 2. Alright, now I'm working with cosine. The amplitude's 1. Since I'm doing a vertical translation, I'm first going to start off with hollow points. And then what do I do with those hollow points? I shift them all up 1. Or not all up 1, minus 2. I'm going to shift them down 2. Okay. And that, and that. Alright, and then it curves down, comes back up. Alright, there's one cycle. And then you can repeat the pattern. Alright, that's all there is to it. Now bringing all the ideas together. Alright, the next 2 examples will really test your understanding of graphing, sine and cosine. Alright, so here we have a reflection. And we reflect first, and then we'll shift at the very end. Alright, the amplitude, a lot of information here. Amplitude's 3. The period is going to change. So I take period, normal period 2 pi, divide by b, which is 2. I get pi. All right, now if I want the phase shift, got to figure out what my starting point is. I have 2x minus pi over 4 is equal to 0. I have 2x is equal to pi over 4. Divide by 2. And I get x is equal to pi over 8. Alright, that's my starting value. Alright, a lot going on here. And my finish. My finish is pi over 8 plus the period, which is pi. So that gives me 9 pi over 8. Then I have to divide the graph into 4 parts. So I take the period and I divide by 4. So those are my increments. And then I also have a vertical translation, or a vertical shift. All right. So let's see, where do we start? Pi over 8. Pi over 8 is smaller than pi over 4, so each of these increments here on the grid I'm going to refer to as pi over 8. So I'm starting at pi over 8. So I'm right here. And I'm moving by increments of pi over 4. So pi over 4 is essentially pi over 8 plus pi over 8. So that's every 2 increments is pi over 4. So that's 3 pi over 8. And then I have 5 pi over 8. Then I have 7 pi over 8. And I gotta add one more increment over here. That's 9 pi over 8. Alright, so I got my parts all divvied up. Now we apply the cosine graph. It's a reflection, so instead of starting up at 3, I'm going to start down at negative 3. I go up, up again, down, down. Just doing the opposite now. And then since it's a shift of plus 1, I'm going to move all the points up 1. And there's my graph now. Alright, so not too difficult once you get the hang of everything. So, just going backwards now. Alright, there's the rest of the graph. Alright, let's do one more example to finally test your understanding. Alright, this is going to be I could just put this on the right side. That's going to be a vertical translation. That's my amplitude is 5. This is my B value. That's going to impact the period. Normal period is 2 pi, so I divide that by pi over 12. Alright, complex fraction. Not too difficult to deal with this stuff. Period is 24. Alright, in this case 24 radians. Now, what else is there? Oh, I just need to divide it into 4 parts. So my period is 24, I divide by 4, and I get 6. Alright, so I'm going by increments of 6 radians. There's no pi involved this time. So I'll divide the grid up like this. I'll say this is 6 radians here, that's 12. That's 18, and that's 24. All right, I'm working with cosine, and let's see here. The maximum's 5, so I'll be up here, and I'll be here, and I'll be all the way down here. The grid needs to be a little bit bigger. All right, then I'm here, and I'm here. Last thing I need to do is apply the vertical translation, move all the points down 3. So then I'm here, and then I'm here, and then I'm all the way down here. And then I'm here, and I'm here. Okay. And there's my cosine graph. All right, so once again, pretty simple stuff. Once you understand what you're doing. All right, begin the assignment at the bottom of the web page. If there's anything you're confused about, any clarification you need, please make sure to ask for help.